Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for the introduction as well. It's great to be virtually with so many people from all over the world, especially from Germany, but there are also people from all over. So thank you very much for the invitation. So thank you very much. So as discussed in the concept, as discussed in the concept note for the seminar, the idea of development has been criticized from various perspectives. And one of the key criticisms relates to the Eurocentrism of the concept. Mainstream development discourse illegitimately dismisses the ways of thinking and being of those outside the industrialized world. Most of the world is presented implicitly or explicitly as backward, in need of assistance, to copy the lives of those in the so-called developed world. While critics of development insist that rather than idealizing the lives of those in the developed world, we should look to the lives of the marginalized, the dispossessed, and the supposedly underdeveloped for inspiration. So some of those criticisms of development, some of this kind of academic criticism, if you like, of development was articulated yesterday in the presentation by Aram Ziai. So we already heard a lot of that academic criticism of development. And while the academics were criticizing, what we also have is we have a kind of resistance on the ground. So citizens of those in these supposedly underdeveloped countries have engaged with development initiatives in all kinds of ways. And one form of engagement involves resistance and the assertion of indigenous concepts and ways of being as viable and desirable alternatives to mainstream development. So with this resistance on the ground and this academic criticism together, we can see that there's an interest in alternatives, which is why we're having a seminar like this, with this interest in alternatives to development, alternatives to the mainstream understanding of development. And along with that, in recent years in particular, we see an interest in concepts like Buen Vivir, Sumak-Hausai, and Ubuntu. And earlier today, we're hearing about Eco-Swaraj. And so there are these kinds of concepts that are seen to be indigenous and seem to be coming from outside of the Western world, and which present alternatives that perhaps we can draw on when trying to think of alternatives to development. So one of these is Ubuntu, and I was asked to speak on Ubuntu, and the organizers asked me, and I sort of said, well, I'm not really qualified to speak on Ubuntu, and I'm not, so I must stress from the outset that this is not really my area of expertise. My area of expertise is more thinking critically about development. But let me put on the table what I can, and then hopefully my colleague, who is speaking after me, might be able to give some more grounded insights into what development is. So there's no consensus about, sorry, not into what development is, but into what Ubuntu is. So there's no consensus on what Ubuntu means exactly, but most commentators describe it as a kind of form of humanness or humanism. And often it's related to this phrase, umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu, which literally just means a person is a person through other people. That's the Zulu, but in several different languages, there are similar terms that express this idea that a person is a person through other people. So if we further explain the concept, one of the key thinkers, Mokgobe Ramose, says that it can be construed to mean that to be a human being is to affirm one's humanity by recognizing the humanity of others, and on that basis, establishing human relations with them. And that it entails a humane, respectful, and polite attitude towards others. Another description of Ubuntu says it's the African principle of transcendence, through which an individual is pulled out of him or herself back towards the ancestors and forward towards the community and toward the potential that each one of us has. And then I think many people have possibly heard the the way that former Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who's a very public figure, speaks about Ubuntu. He really popularized the notion in the 1990s in South Africa. And he talks about it by saying, my humanity is caught up, is inextricably bound up in yours. So these are some of the ways in which people talk about and describe Ubuntu. So while there are lots of different ways of talking about Ubuntu, people seem to agree that it's about treating people humanely, it's against individualism, it's about interconnectedness. And then there's this kind of thought of, can it be used to articulate decolonial alternatives to development? So can we use it in the development or the post-development debate to try to think about an alternative to development? And there are certainly people who think we can. So for example, and interestingly, some people are linking it up to concepts like Buen Vivir or Suma Kausai, concepts coming from other parts of the world, and saying that these alternatives could work together to help us bring about different alternatives to the kind of mainstream form of development or to westernized forms of development. So there's a little bit of optimism that we might be able to use Ubuntu to help build these kinds of alternatives to development. But then I'm going to be that difficult person that raises some concerns and cautions about the project of using concepts like Ubuntu to try to build alternatives to development. I must stress, I come from, I'm an academic, I'm not an activist. And so what's nice about the seminars, you're bringing together people who come more from an academic environment with people who are coming from activist and civil society environments together. So I think that those who are coming from that more activist environment are bringing you some of the grounded experiences and practices that might be of use. And we saw that this morning in this morning's session with some of the examples from India and Nepal and so on that give us that grounded perspective. But for me, I speak from my limited position as an academic. And so I'm going to raise some questions and some concerns about what happens when you try to use these kinds of alternative concepts to think about alternatives to development. And so here I want to think a little bit about appropriation of concepts. So if we think first about the concept of development itself, a concept like development does not arrive on the scene fully worked out. It's never simply imposed onto a neutral and unresisting community. So every time a new agent of development, like an NGO worker, an aid worker, a government official arrives in a community, this thing that we call development ends up being worked out in different ways in interaction with that community in place. And the communities in place respond to the development project in different ways, which might include resistance, appropriation, collaboration. I'm sure those of you who have some experience in working in development projects and that sort of thing will have experienced that experience of, you know, the development agent that arrives. Sometimes the project gets changed and reshaped on the ground. It doesn't just kind of arrive and plonk itself onto the ground unchanged. So we can say that development is reworked, it is contested and appropriated on the ground. So that means that it's transformed in some way. So if I give an example, when a development agent, maybe a state official, arrives with a local development plan, people will not either fully embrace or fully reject the plan. They might, for example, resist attempts at being resettled, but welcome the provision of electricity or improved water or sanitation and so on. They might pressure the official to change the plan, or if they don't like the plan, they might undermine it in more subtle ways if they don't feel able to openly resist it. So the discourses of governments and international agencies tell us one thing, but the actual situation on the ground might be very different, because this thing that we call development, and thus that we're trying to think of alternatives to, is a very messy, amorphous, ever-changing organism. It's not one thing that is always shaped in the same way. But now if development can be contested, reworked, appropriated, reappropriated in all of these different ways, what about the alternatives that we might propose? What about an alternative like Ubuntu? If it is true that a concept like development arrives and gets reworked, contested, reappropriated, appropriated, moved in all of these different ways, what happens to a concept like Ubuntu? Is it not also the case that it will also be open to contestation and appropriation? And what does that mean for suggesting alternatives? So it seems to me that, yes, Ubuntu does also, like with any other big concept like development and justice and freedom and buen vivir and these kind of big concepts, are very open to contestation and appropriation. And in the South African context where I am, I'm very aware of some of the debates about the appropriation of a concept like Ubuntu. And these debates are quite insightful for highlighting some of the dangers that come about when we're trying to come up with these development alternatives. So in South Africa, certainly people accuse others of misusing the concept of Ubuntu. So for example, Ndumiso Dladla accuses several white scholars who have worked on the concept of Ubuntu of producing, in his words, anthropologically and cultural hollow versions of Ubuntu, which continue to be employed in sustaining the epistemicide initiated at the conquest of the indigenous people of South Africa in the unjust wars of colonization. It's a big mouthful, but basically he's saying that white people use Ubuntu to encourage everyone to just forgive each other and be nice to each other and so on. And that actually advances coloniality and prevents the possibility of justice and reparation. Okay, so he certainly thinks that Ubuntu can be misused in that way. And then you also have scholars like Qobo and Nyati, who also feel in a different way that Ubuntu is being misappropriated. They say both that colonial officials misuse the term to give us the idea that Africans are kind and not materialistic, and then use that to justify depriving Africans of certain material goods because, you know, they don't like all these material goods and that sort of thing. And then they also say that in the contemporary era, the post-apartheid government has used Ubuntu rhetoric very often to advance its ends, but it's just a rhetorical move. So they're just using the rhetoric. And then some other thinkers, and I'll happily share this presentation, and then I have all those people if anyone is interested in reading them. So some other thinkers are also skeptical and argue that Ubuntu is being used by post-apartheid elites to advance a particular agenda that they feel is not the right agenda in South Africa. Others feel that a lot of capitalists use a term like Ubuntu to justify certain business interests. And it's quite funny if you look, this is certainly true in South Africa. I don't know how true it is in other Southern African countries, but you can find Ubuntu everything. So some of you might have heard of Ubuntu software. It's like a computer software program. You'll find things like an Ubuntu Business Academy. Apparently there's a company that provides Ubuntu security alarms. So even a security company that will use a term. So what this shows is the way that a term can be appropriated to advance all kinds of interests. And there I forgot to put up some of the people who are making these arguments that Ubuntu can be misappropriated in certain ways. So regardless of the origins of this term, so this term might have origins in certain kinds of indigenous value systems, for example, it is open to appropriation by various actors for a range of ends. And ironically, even my speaking on Ubuntu and the organizers' interest in the term would by some of these critics be regarded with suspicion. They would say, well, you know, someone like me is just another white person using the term to advance her career, that maybe when people in the West organize conferences around this. They're appropriating these cultural concepts for their own ends or to appear progressive. So, you know, there's a lot of possibility of criticism of that kind, of why are we using this term and for what ends. So what do we do if we recognize that, you know, where does this take us? So I'm giving you this kind of critical perspective and showing you that from my context, I can see how a term that is presented initially as an alternative, as an anti-Western, indigenous alternative, is taken up in all of these different ways and can be appropriated and reappropriated for all kinds of ends. What do we do then? How do we respond to this? So the one thing that I think some people might do is to try to insist upon a particular interpretation, to insist that there's one way to interpret development and there's one way to interpret something like Ubuntu or perhaps Summa Causai or Ecoswaraj or Buen Vivir or these other alternatives. So we could say something like this. We could say development is a Western concept which prioritizes economic growth and industrialization, whereas Ubuntu is an African concept which emphasizes togetherness and shared humanity. So we can insist on those kinds of definitions and pinning it down to say development must mean this, Ubuntu must mean that, Buen Vivir must mean this. I think that the problem here is that we can't do this because concepts like this are by their nature contested. Any of these big idea concepts like democracy, freedom, justice, but also development, Ubuntu, Buen Vivir, are concepts that by their nature are open to contestation and appropriation. So I think that this means that it's difficult to say that we must reject development and embrace some other alternative, because development is reworked in different ways in different places. It doesn't always mean the same thing. And similarly, Ubuntu or Buen Vivir or any alternative concept will also be contested, will be appropriated by elites and used to cover, you know, as a sort of cover for elite projects and so on. That is the nature of how concepts work. So I don't think so much that we can really insist that we have a particular interpretation that is the correct interpretation. That doesn't mean that we can't be vigilant to see how people are using the term. So what I think is important is to look at any project, whether it claims to be a development project or whether it claims to be an alternative project, to look at what that, how the terminology is being used. What is somebody who is claiming to be promoting a project on Ubuntu or Buen Vivir? What is that? What are they using the term for? And to be vigilant of these possibilities of appropriation, but also to be aware that that's what concepts do. They are contested, they will be taken up in different ways. So I think then somebody would say, well, and this is an important question for those like those at the seminar who are saying we need to come up with alternatives to development. Somebody could say to us, well, you know, development means different things to different people. So development can mean a project that is ecologically friendly, that is radically democratic. In certain spaces and instances, the people using that term mean that. In other instances, they mean a big dam or a road network. I mean, the term is used in different ways. So is there any point of replacing talk with Ubuntu with alternative, talk of development? Is there any point of replacing it with talk of Ubuntu or talk of Buen Vivir? Why do that, seeing as these different concepts will in any case be reworked and their meaning will be changed on the ground? I think that there is actually some point to using these alternative concepts, because I think that using the alternative concepts can be helpful in that it helps do something that some people are calling shifting the geography of reason. All that means is that historically we have treated, we have acted as if reason and knowledge comes from one part of the world. It has European or Western origins. And when we insist on using concepts and ideas from elsewhere, we are pushing forward the idea that every part of the world puts ideas out. Everyone from any part of the world is a contributor to building knowledge. So one advantage of actually insisting upon using these alternative concepts and insisting on opposing concepts like development is just that even by changing the language, you are implicitly resisting the idea that everything that's good must come from the West. So I think there's actually some value in using these concepts, and of course in looking at how people have put into practice these concepts, what practices are associated with those concepts. Because when we do that, we insist that we are trying to build concepts and practices on on what is locally there, rather than importing everything from the West. So I think there is a value and a use for using these concepts, but with some cautions. And so I'm nearly finishing now. And so I just want to put out these cautions, which I think we need to be aware of when we start to try to develop these kinds of alternatives. So the one caution is just to be aware that elites will co-opt these concepts. So we see that with various attempts, say, to make development more sustainable or to make development more participatory, that language of sustainability and participation is co-opted eventually, and it makes its way into World Bank documents and so on. The same can happen with any concept, and there's no reason to think that a concept like Ubuntu Buen Vivir or Summa Causa will not suffer the same fate. It will and is already being co-opted by elites. So then it becomes harder to disentangle when this is a kind of radical alternative and when it is just part of the mainstream discourse, because there will be that co-option. And we also have to be careful, and I say this as somebody from, I'm a South African, but I'm a relatively privileged South African. On top of it, I'm a white South African, but elites within third world countries, within global South countries, whichever problematic term you prefer, elites will also use those concepts in ways that are sometimes about advancing their own projects. So when I'm talking about elites, I'm not only speaking about the third world, I'm also perhaps speaking about the relatively privileged in any space. Can be ones who are using a concept in ways that maybe on the ground are actually marginalizing the already marginalized rather than really being empowering. Also, there's the danger of romanticization. So using these concepts in privileged spaces can potentially romanticize indigenous or marginalized people and present them as a kind of noble savages, is the term that some thinkers use, who can teach the depressed and alienated citizens of the global north how to regain their humanity. So there is a danger when those in the West, such as those in Germany, have an interest in these concepts, that linked to that can be the romanticization of the lives of others who supposedly live in harmony with nature and aren't materialistic. And so then there can be a romanticization of those lives and an appropriation of the concepts in ways that are ultimately more beneficial for those in the global north and the global south. And then there are also interesting challenges that arise when we move from the local to the global. And in the discussion this morning with Ashish Kotari and Sanjeev, we're talking about this already a little bit. So when it's incredibly valuable to have these, to have opportunities for people to talk to each other across different spaces. Otherwise, local initiatives can be very parochial and closed-minded because they're not coming into contestation with anyone else. We can, of course, learn from each other. But when we try to create this kind of big thinking around these different alternatives, there's a risk that, again, certain voices get silenced, certain people get to represent those local groups. Those are usually more elite people. And so inevitably, when you're trying to build a global consensus and a global dialogue around all these different local actors, certain local experiences will get silenced or marginalized. So we have to be mindful in the move from the local to the global about whose voices get more heard. And of course, someone like myself, an academic in South Africa, gets more heard than others in the same space whose experiences will be very, very different. And so it's quite difficult to move from the local to the global. For a start, I mean, it's hard enough when we have to translate between 3 languages, but everyone who can participate in this space must be able to speak a language which actually in Africa, very many people do not speak one of the global languages, whether it is English or Spanish or French or any other language like that. So those are some important cautions that I think, and I think that one of the role of those of us in academia is to sound those cautions and to make people aware of those risks. But I think that with those cautions in place, my sense is that the exploration of the ideas, concepts, and practices of those most marginalized by mainstream development is an important component of struggles against injustice. And so I'm interested in hearing others' experiences and ideas and in continuing the conversation. And I'll happily share, I mean, there's some of the further reading, but I will happily share the presentation because, so if anyone is interested, these readings are about Ubuntu and are specifically showing some of the dangers that are faced by alternative concepts that easily get co-opted for what are sometimes quite disempowering projects. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Matthews, for these critical observations that are aspects that we need to keep in mind in our discussions so that we don't fall into that trap in our discussions. So looking at my watch, I can say that after the next presentation, there will be more room for further discussions. But I have one question for you. If I got that right, you cannot say that behind Ubuntu, there is a visible social movement, just like with Buen Vivir. Is that correct? Did I get that right? Or how would you describe that?
I don't think there's not a coherent social movement organizing around Ubuntu. There will be individuals, groups using it, but I don't, and certainly there are state officials in South Africa using the concept, and similar concepts are sometimes used by state officials elsewhere. But I mean, it would also be an interesting question to pose to those talking about Buen Vivir, because I suspect that also with a concept like Buen Vivir, there's not going to be one single coherent movement, but rather diverse movements and also state actors using the concept for quite different ends. So Ubuntu is yeah, there's not like in South Africa some kind of Ubuntu movement for alternatives to development, no.
Ja, danke. Gibt es,
thank you very much. Is there a question from the audience? So just for information or understanding, please ask them. And if not, we would continue with Tinodenda Tenda Chibinbi. There was one question on the understanding of Ms. Matthews. What does she understand when she talks about elites? Are those experts or academics, or are those elites to be understood in a broader sense? Yes, now I can see the question.
Do you want me to answer it now? Okay. I think elites in a broader sense. So what I see in sort of activism work in South Africa is that, you know, at every level, those who speak are often speaking on behalf of those who are less who are less able to access those spaces. So even when you have a social movement, who's chosen to speak, who's chosen to write the statement, will be the one who articulates the message, and that's not always going to be a message that resonates with everyone else. So we have to, so I don't just mean academic elites, I certainly mean state elites, but even within social movement struggles and civil society struggles, it's quite interesting to see, and I'm sure it can't just be a South African observation, the way in which certain people are the ones who articulate what struggle means, and sometimes their articulation is not necessarily representative. Well, it'll never be representative of what everyone thinks, but it is easy for it is always possible for elites to co-opt a concept. So we have to be careful and vigilant of that, is what I'm saying.
Okay, danke. Da ist noch eine Frage von Wolf.
Thank you. And another question of Mr. Reichert. It's about, is there an approximation between Ubuntu and human rights? Do they come together?
Well, that's actually quite interesting, because human rights is another concept that is seen as very much, there's a lot of debate in Africa about the use of human rights, because it's seen as a Western concept that's imported then to South Africa. So what is interesting is that some South African activists have effectively managed to use human rights discourse to win important battles, like battles against eviction, battles against struggles for land and so on. So I haven't seen closely people using Ubuntu and human rights, but what I can see is that, with any concept, it is possible to use it for quite different ends, both for justice achieving ends and also to oppress justice. So, but I don't think there's a close relation between, say, human rights work in South Africa and Ubuntu. I might be wrong, but it's not something I see.
Okay, vielen Dank. Ich hätte hier noch.
Thank you very much. And maybe two other questions. One question I would like to postpone to the bigger discussion round later, but first question, Ms. Matthews, is do you see a possibility of Ubuntu to contribute to the deeply polarized concepts and opposites in South Africa? And the second question is, well, I think you almost answered this. It's about romanticizing Ubuntu, what it's used for that purpose.
In terms of the polarization, one of the problems is that Ubuntu in South Africa, and I don't think this applies to the use of the concept in other African countries, and Ubuntu is not just a South African thing, but in South Africa, Ubuntu was mobilized in the 1990s to push a reconciliation agenda. So to push the idea that, that we must continue and move forward as Black and white South Africans after the problems of the past. And what that meant is that some people feel that Ubuntu was used to silence calls for justice and reparations. And so there is that connotation with Ubuntu. But then on the other hand, others are using Ubuntu to push, to say that actually Ubuntu is something you can use to insist upon justice and reparations rather. So in terms of the polarization that the person is talking about, Ubuntu was used to try to address racial polarization, but in some ways that I think backfired in South Africa, because what it meant is that there were not significant reparations. And so there's a strong sense that there's unfinished business at the end of apartheid. I don't know if that is answering the question. In terms of the romanticization, yes, I think that it is possible, especially for those positioned like most of you in Germany, to romanticize, to imagine that, that maybe Germans are very selfish, or people in the West are selfish and materialistic, but, somewhere out there exists a group of people who are all share everything and act in solidarity, and that can be a real romanticization of the ways in which others live.
Ja, vielen Dank für diese Klärungen, Frau Messner.
Thank you very much for these insights. And I'm so delighted that you are here later too. But now we have to go back to the agenda. Mr. Thomas Mortensen and Gloria. I'm sorry, your questions will be answered later, especially to Gloria. I would like to ask you to ask that question later in the chat. So thank you and hello.
Ja, ich sehe Tino Tenda Chim.
I can see Tino Tenda Chimpindi is can be seen on the screen. After these short questions about Ubuntu, we will talk about them later on in more detail. After these questions, we continue our journey. We go a little further north to Zimbabwe, where we will meet a very interesting young man. I've already mentioned his name, Tino Tenda Chibindi, and we are very much looking forward to what you will say about your experiences, your goals, and your wishes. So, Tino Tenda Chibindi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the platform. Yeah, I was actually listening to what you were saying about my advocacy journey so far, and it actually has been a while since I've been working with the Southern Africa TDH Youth Network. And specifically for today, I would like to thank you for the opportunity which I've been granted to share on youth perspectives and how us as young people, probably someone who works very, very closely with young people, feel about the subject of alternatives to development. I won't say much about myself. I think a lot has been said, so I'll just go straight into my presentation. My presentation is basic. It is two parts. The first part is the PowerPoint, where I'll be sharing with you some of the youth views which I managed to get when I was doing consultations prior to this meeting. And the last part is going to be a video which will support some of the things that I'm going to be saying in the short space of time I'm going to present. So my presentation is basically straightforward and straight to the point. Why? Because as young people, we just like to keep things straight to the point so that we can always do follow-ups to say, we talked about this and this issue, and in terms of progress, where are we? First, I'll be talking about development, definition of terms, what we as young people see as development, since the whole subject of alternative development might seem as a new subject to a lot of young people. I will also define or I'll also speak to some of the alternatives to development. And then lastly, I'll speak to our youth views and youth perspectives on this subject. We can go to the next slide. Right, so by definition, development, we define it by the basic definition of it being an improvement in the country's economic and social conditions. More specifically, it refers to improvements in the way of managing in areas natural and human resources in order to create wealth and improve people's daily livelihoods. Next slide. By alternatives, now linking it with development, we defined it in a way where we could get a lot of information coming from young people. And one of the most basic definitions we could come up with was alternatives just being other means to ensure or two or more possibilities to a particular situation. So that was our basic definition to alternatives when we are linking it to development for us to be able to understand the subject a bit more better. Next slide. So I think I'm going to thank the previous speaker, Professor Matthews. she unpacked a lot of issues in terms of Ubuntu, and it makes my job easy when I pass through the slide because a lot has been unpacked. So I'll just speak to what I have on Ubuntu. Ubuntu, on our basic definition, even in Zimbabwe, we see Ubuntu as the concept of being a person because of another person. So it's I am because you are because I am. So it's a cultural thing. It comes from a very, very cultural background where people support and respect each other to the extent that if I am a child, I'm not a responsibility only of the people who take care of me, but I'm also a responsibility of my community in the sense of Ubuntu. It's a way of I can even break down it to say you are your brother's keeper, you are your sister's keeper. It's just a way of uniting people. It's a way of making sure that we are on the same platform as human beings, regardless of color, gender, or race. The subject of Ubuntu, I see it as a subject which is very, very critical and a subject which should actually be supreme when we are looking at any development stage that we might have. Because without the sense of Ubuntu, there is little or no progress at all, which we can say we have garnered, because there might be a sense of superiority and inferiority complex when people are not at a platform of saying, I respect you because you are the person that you are, and you respect me because of who I am. So my views are very much important, the same as your views are very much important. So you see that once this concept is taken up to stronghold, development will be inclusive, and it will be development for the people, being pushed by the people, not development coming as probably a school of thought to say this is how development should be, but development will be coming from a best practice experience whereby people will be pushing for development which they see fit for themselves without pushing for other agendas. I will move on to my next slide. Right, so as I said in this presentation, I am honored to be speaking on behalf of a lot of young people because it has the insights and the views of young people from Zimbabwe, young people from Zambia and Mozambique and other areas in SADC, whom we have been working together with in consultations to say, what do you feel about this subject? What are probably the cross-cutting issues when we are looking at alternatives to development or development as a subject in general? So one of the main issues which is cross-cutting, which we're able to garner, was that development models, the current development models which are there, they sideline the participation of youths in terms of civic spaces. So when we are talking about civic spaces, probably in the context of my country, we are talking about who has access to sit on in a particular office, who has access to make a certain decision, who has access or who has the ability to influence a certain process. So the models of development which are there as it stands, they sideline the participation of youths, probably because the involvement of young people in the processes do not garner or promote effective participation from young people. So young people probably are involved, but in as much as they are involved, their participation does not yield the results that they intend to yield. As a result, you see that if we are to encourage a culture of consultations with young people, especially when we are looking at development in the areas that they live in, per se in marginalized and raw areas, they are marginalized and raw areas which are very rich in mineral resources. Those marginalized areas have investors who usually come because they have seen a mineral mineral that they might be interested in, and they come, they just look at the immediate problems which affect the people in the community to say, probably the people need a bore, the people need this, the people need this. But when they are doing these consultations, when they want to come on the ground, they usually just consult the community leadership, they usually just consult probably the district leaderships. But the young people who comprise the majority of the population in those areas are usually a bit behind. So they'll be told things at a later stage when things are already in progress, when things are already now being implemented. Whereas if consultations are done from the get-go, from the foundation, with young people also sharing how they exactly feel about certain issues, you will see that development will have a whole new meaning altogether. And one of the things which we also feel that communities always, most of the time, tend to be vulnerable to people who come in with ideas of development, to people who come in with proposals of development. It's because there is a culture which has been developed to say the way that probably we develop ourselves in urban towns, in urban cities, and the way that development is seen in rural areas is different. So with the high rates of unemployment in areas, young people are exploited in most of the issues, and they are left vulnerable to a lot of things. For instance, we have an area in Kadoma where there's a lot of gold. But if Kadoma is a city in Zimbabwe where there's a lot of gold, so you can see that if you look closely to how the employment rates are in terms of young people in that area, how they are being given employment, it's poor compared to how the investors or how the people who want to garner or want to benefit from the resources in that area source out hands to come and assist. So there's an imbalance to say the community holds probably the tools to development. But in as much as they hold the tools to development, they cannot develop because probably they do not have enough knowledge or they don't have resources to say how best can we make use of our resources to benefit us. So those with the upper hand, they come and they take note that there is a high unemployment rates. So probably they can have young people involved in one or two projects, but how sustainable is it? In most cases, it will not be sustainable. So the high employment rates will just remain there. And as they remain, young people will just be vulnerable to anyone who comes to say, we can assist you with this for this certain time. But in terms of sustainability, there is no sustainability in how that development which will be given to them will come. Generally, we feel that as young people, to try and curb this problem of how development is perceived as of now, we should encourage that there should be a lot of local investment and job creation, especially in mining areas, where we feel that there are people who are benefiting more than the people who live with the minerals, more than the custodians probably of the minerals. There should be probably policies which can be put in place to say, when someone is coming to a specific area to get minerals, how is the employment rate going to be attended to? Who is going to be involved? How are they going to improve the community, hence develop it? Is there any probably underdeveloped areas which are seen by anyone who can come to the community and say, this community probably needs more schools? So which role are you going to play in terms of developing the community to make sure that we can see clear local investment? That should always be encouraged. And we can also go further to say in terms of agriculture. In Southern Africa, we do a lot of agriculture. And we can be in a position of saying, how best can we encourage, how best can we teach, how best can we promote sustainable agriculture in rural areas? We have rural areas, especially tobacco farming rural areas, where there is no sustainable agriculture at all. I think you hear about it, especially in the video that I'll share. There is just people who are doing what they are doing in terms of the season that they are doing. So if they are probably growing tobacco, they grow tobacco for that specific season. They burn what they need to burn, and they move forward without actually noting to say, how is this sustainable to the community? Will I be able to come back in the very same community probably 5 to 10 years later and do another agricultural activity? So people will just be doing things to benefit them at that very moment, but in the long run, it will disadvantage the community at large. Hence, we need to push and encourage for sustainable agriculture in rural areas. There is also an ideology of lack of inclusive development. When I talk about inclusive development, I'm saying we have children and young people with disabilities in our various communities. And at times where we are saying there is development which is happening, in terms of probably we can go back to grassroots to speak of even place centers. How inclusive or is the development which is being done by those who can develop inclusive to the benefit of the general population of young people and children? So it's not at inclusive, and there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of making sure that how we develop our community is inclusive to everyone who is part of the community, and is inclusive to even children who are part or who have the right to say we want to enjoy our childhood, we want to have, if they want to maintain their childhood innocence, they only maintain that in an inclusive environment where we can see a child with disabilities and a child who has no disability actually accessing and having equal opportunity to enjoy their rights in the development areas which they would have been provided. We can move to the next slide. Also, in order to curb this this subject of alternative to development, it's also important and key to do community engagements and dialogues. Community engagements and dialogues, they are important because one, they promote participation of any age group in that community. But however, when we have these engagements and dialogues, that's where we go to the stage of saying, how best are we setting the agenda to speak to the development we want for the community? So you see that prioritization of issues which are critical probably in the community, or issues which are critical in the area, prioritization should be straight. How we prioritize things should be straight, in the agenda setting which the community and probably the people in offices of influence and power should be clear as to how the community is going to play their role, and how the people who are developing the area are also going to play their role to the benefit of the general populace in the community. We also have a lot of laws and policies which promote development here. It's not only a Zimbabwean problem, it's not a Mozambique, it's not a Zambian problem, it's not a problem in Mozambique only, but I think I would like to see it as a regional problem, where we have laws which are there, which if properly enforced can help, especially in pushing for the development that we want and the development that we need. But however, because of lack of enforcement of those laws, and because at times they are not even aligned, because there are some laws which contradict each other, but at the end of the day, they disadvantage or they give confusion to the whole subject of development. They should be aligned and they should be properly enforced, especially those which are binding regionally or internationally, like the laws which we get from the signatory from the signatory treaty bodies which we sign as countries.
Tino Tenda,
darf ich mal African Union, laws which we get from the UN. Since we are
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Eine Frage an die Regie.
So, can I ask you something? We're a little bit under time pressure. Could you maybe speed up slightly? So there's also a question from the chat, which suits the part of your speech quite well. What about the relationship between your political position as a youth worker and the institution, the political institutions? Do you feel heard? What kind of opportunity do you have to fight against major investors and get a voice against them?
Okay, so I think in the interest of time, I'll just run down the points which I have left, and then I'll attend to the questions before I leave you to watch the video. Is that okay?
Ja klar, es tut mir leid, aber...
Of course, I'm really sorry.
All right. Where was I? Right, accountability. So we should also be in a position of having whoever comes with an agenda of development in a certain area to be accountable for probably the pros and cons that the development that they are bringing is bringing to the community and the people who lives and stays in that area. Another key issue, which we feel that it can be a great achievement in going in the highway of development and in also pushing for alternative development, is encouraging and pushing for youth to run for public office. In terms of how the world is changing every day. You can see even now, because of the COVID-19, the world as we used to know it, it has changed totally. And probably we are adjusting to this new normal. And because of technology, we are still able to meet up even virtually and discuss pressing issues and push for issues. So young people should also be put in a position like that, even when we are looking at who runs for public office, to say the understanding that I might have of a certain issue and the understanding that an office holder who is 60 years old, but who needs to stand up and push for the issues of young people is different. I am speaking from a technological perspective. I am speaking even from a best experiences perspective. So we should make sure that even youths are encouraged to run for public offices so that they can be part of the development agenda, and they can also make sure that they are putting issues directly which encourage development that they feel is needed. So I think for now, this can be it, because in terms of laws and policies, I think I've touched it on enforcement and existing laws. But however, with the little minutes that I think I'm left with, I will allow you to watch a video which has young people from Zimbabwe, Zambia, and also Mozambique, just sharing their ideas in part of the consultations we were doing prior to this meeting and how they feel about the subject altogether. Thank you. So you can play the video.
The current development models that we have, they deliberately sideline the participation of young people from the onset in terms of policy planning, who sits in what office and who influences which decision.
But I agree that young people should be included in developmental issues and that they should be consulted when we have investors that want to come in our areas and they want to bring development.
We have youth who are unemployed, not because we do not have resources, but maybe due to the prioritization factor that maybe governments tend not to include youth in its planning and development phases.
I think that you all are seeing what's happening in Mozambique, in Cape Delgado, where we have gas and oil, and there is a terrorism. And I think that one of the causes to the problem that we are facing now is that the group that sponsor these terrorists found there a lot of local problems.
That in every area that they are mining, they are able to ensure that the resources benefit the locals, not to continue expropriating profits outside.
still registered. But pane zvimwe zvisingatotenderi zvamfana namekiro musazi chisungisa. Saisi tichitongoda kuti ivo vakauya vakangofamba ndova uchingofamba vachitaura nevanhu sematauro tichitongoda nemuso tozoti obvious azvigumire pane.
Tiri panyaya ye-environment ipapo tiri pa-agriculture toshuwirawo uye tokurudzirawo kuti hurumende iite kuti vanhu vaite sustainable agriculture instead of kupisa nemiti zviri kukonzeresa deforestation vanhu vopisawo nemarasha.
Also depends with the industry, but we see that there is no inclusive development, especially in areas of mining. But in tourism, I've seen something at least here. I don't know in other areas of Zambia, but I think for Mukoni village, we've seen that the people are included. They benefit from that. Of course, maybe they are not entirely getting the full benefit that the companies they get.
So I was thinking it would be good for us to engage with the local government together with the national government and as well the mining sector, so that we can tell them our issues which are affecting us as children in Kadoma, so that we speak out our problems and as well they can address these problems as we are being affected by these mining activities in our community.
Biggest point is not with us. The biggest point is with our state authorities, because I think that in all of our countries,
ja,
we have
vielen Dank, Tino Tender, für diesen Überblick und diese eindrucksvolle Vielfalt der Möglichkeiten und der Aktivitäten.
Thank you, Tino Tender, for presenting these options, opportunities that you presented to us. And maybe do you have the time to answer some questions? What possibilities would you desire for young people in Africa? What job offers should there be? That was the first question. And then maybe Ms. Matthews may join in with a comment. But first, my question to Tino Tender, what opportunities are there to find a job or a profession?
All right, thank you so much for the question. So firstly, I think from the education system that we have currently, it's not pushing for skills development, which can be very, very essential after one is done with his education. So before we even look at the opportunities or the jobs which can be available for young people, we should also make sure that the background which they're coming from their education background, in terms of skills development, how best are they being taught a special skill or a certain skill which can be very, very relevant, or which they can then use when they are now in the community, when they are no longer at school. So once someone has a skill, job opportunities, they can be a lot. You can have a variety to choose from, because it will be just be a situation of aligning the skill that you have with the current possible jobs or opportunities that might be there to suit what you can do.
Okay, aber so ganz konkret, ganz bestimmte Vorstellungen.
In concrete terms, so you do not want to say what kind of jobs there are, what you would like to have as jobs?
You know, if we start breaking down jobs, there are a lot of jobs which is mining. Like in mining areas, I don't feel like there is need for people to be getting main force from elsewhere when they can teach young people who are done with their education or probably looking for jobs to mine the resources that are already in that area. So we can have young people in mining, we can have young people in entrepreneurship. In entrepreneurship, it's a huge platform where we are coming, we are presenting a whole lot of ideas. We are even hearing the ideas that they have and they get support. We can have young people even in advocacy work where they can be peer educators. We can have young people doing the basic jobs which we are used to teaching, doctors and things like that. But basically looking at the context and what is currently happening, skills development will be the foundation to see which skill do the general populace, or which skill does 5 young people in a group of 10 have. So how best can we make sure that we bring that skill and we make sure that they are employed, and then the rest they can be offered the jobs that are available depending on the context of their community.
Okay, vielen Dank erstmal. Wir haben noch einen.
Thank you very much. Maybe Ms. Matthews, would you like to comment on what you just heard, or some of these aspects?
Maybe in commenting, I've been watching the chat, and maybe the only comment I would have at this stage answers one of the questions in the chat, where somebody's asking if youth in Africa would like inclusion into development or alternatives to development, because a lot of the question for jobs and economic opportunities and investment and skills development is more like inclusion in development. I don't know if Tinotenda agrees with me, but I think that certainly there's a lot of the mobilization and protest activity in Southern Africa looks more like a desire for inclusion in development than a push for alternatives to development. And that poses challenges for those who believe that what we should be looking for is alternatives to development. So for example, in South Africa, when you see, we have a lot of protest activity in South Africa, and usually that protest activity, sometimes it's about not wanting mining companies in because they're damaging the land. That certainly happens, but also often it's about, we want jobs, we want electricity, we want roads, we want skills, development opportunities, things like that. So we have to take seriously when people are asking for inclusion to development, and then think of how to think about that from the perspective of those who are concerned or who favor alternatives to development. I don't know if I'm making sense, but that was a question that Albert put in the chat.
Was that a question addressed to Tinotenda? I'm not quite sure.
From me, no, not really, but I was wondering if he agrees with me. It was really a response to what Tino Tenda was saying, and also to the question in the chat from Albert about whether what youth want is inclusion in development, or whether what youth want is alternatives to development. And I think there are people who want each of those, but I don't know what Tino Tenda thinks.
All right. Personally, I would go for inclusion in development rather than alternatives to development, because the whole aspect of alternatives to development, just like it was to me, I stand as a voice of a lot of young people. It's a new subject, but when you just speak of development, we have an idea of what development is or how development should shape out. So basically, if we can push now for inclusion and effective participation of young people in the development agenda, that would be a notion that I can support.
Gut, dann wäre hier noch eine.
All right, then I have another important question for Tino Tenda, or also to Ms. Matthews. What does it look like? What possibilities are there for you in the production of raw materials? What possibilities are there for the communities and the local movements to be included and to resist if necessary?
Yeah, Tino Tenda, bitte.
Tino Tenda, please.
All right. In terms of the raw materials and the possibilities which might lie there, I think in terms of access, there is no access. Access is there probably, but there is still a lot of work to be done in terms of access, because access becomes the problem when we look at a lot of development agendas, and even if we go for inclusivity of young people, how do they have access, and in terms of the access that they have, how best are they then in positions of influencing the kind of production or the kind of raw materials that can come to them in the name of development. I speak especially with a bias of children and young people in rural and marginalized areas, because we have a lot of issues coming there. And in terms of development, there is development which happens on a daily basis, but there is still a huge gap in how we can connect them to that development. So accessibility to
Frau Matthews, bitte.
Ms. Matthews.
Yeah, and I think there's a very big question, you know, the inclusion of people in the extraction of raw materials. If I understood correctly, maybe the translation, something is lost. Yeah, I mean, there will be some opportunities and there will also not be. It's also very different from one country to another. In South Africa, there are very big firms, very big companies. It's quite an industrialized economy driven by a lot of big companies, which makes it harder for smaller local groups to have access and drive anything really, because we are dominated, even at the level of shops, we are dominated by big supermarkets, big companies and so on, but that's not true for the whole continent. So there might be more possibilities for local initiatives to control resources and to extract and make alternative kinds of projects in other countries, but it's quite hard in South Africa where we have commercial farming, industrialized economic activity and so on. It's actually harder to drive alternatives there, I think. But I think, you know, that question can be answered in very different ways depending on the context.
Okay, vielen Dank. Ich sehe hier noch eine.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think this is an important question that I see here. Ms. Hackman said, how can the concept of Ubuntu be implemented into practice? Do you have some examples of best practice that you can relate to?
Weiß es nicht, wer die Frage.
I don't know who wants to answer that question. Maybe Tino Tender, you go first.
I think on the concept of to start, because she has a better appreciation and understanding.
I think I couldn't hear well there, but I think he's throwing the difficult question on me. Thank you, Tino Tenda. Yeah, I think, you know, a concept like Ubuntu, someone was also asking in the chat, what does it mean literally? They were asking in German, and I think it's like, I can't speak German, Menschlichkeit or humanness. Literally, Ubuntu means like Ubuntu is a person, Ubuntu is personness. Literally, that's what the word literally means. But what can it be in practice? I think it's like a concept like freedom or development. It can mean different things in practice. You can take it to mean quite different things. So at one point, the South African government was linking it to a very conservative moral regeneration campaign, to very conservative family values. At another time, it can be used to emphasize reconciliation and you know, love and inclusivity, but it can be used in different ways. And that's kind of both the beauty and the danger of big concepts, is that what is important is to look at how people are using them, whether that concept is development or whether that concept is Ubuntu or Buen Vivir. When a concept means something so general like humanness, you can imagine that it can be used in different ways. But in general, a concept like Ubuntu must stress solidarity. It tends to be about solidarity, community, and anti-individualism. So in any project that would be strongly individualistic would be in tension with Ubuntu, because Ubuntu is this idea of our common humanity and doing something maybe more together, with this idea of we can only build ourselves through building others. So that would be maybe the limit of the concept, is it can't be used. It would be difficult to use the concept for a very individualistic program.
Werner?
Well, I think I have another interesting question for Ms. Matthews. I just read it to you in English. Probably you saw it.
Concept in this context important?
I was just seeing that question on the chat. I must say, so in some ways I know more about the Rhodes Must Fall movement than Ubuntu, because I've written more on that. I can't remember a single instance where Ubuntu language was used during the Rhodes Must Fall struggle. Maybe it was, I'm sure somewhere somebody might have, but certainly there wasn't a strong push. Yeah, so I think there's also sometimes the danger of maybe people from outside South Africa or Africa wanting Ubuntu to be a concept that can be linked up with Buen Vivir, because we need, you know, an African one. We have Buen Vivir or Sumakausai, we have maybe Eco Swaraj, but what do we have in South Africa? So I don't see, Ubuntu is used a lot on the ground. People talk about Ubuntu and the need for Ubuntu. It's definitely a concept that people use in everyday life all the time. But in terms of the political struggles around Rhodes Must Fall, around decolonization of universities, I have not seen that being linked to Ubuntu. Maybe it has been, but not extensively.
Okay, ich hoffe, die Frage ist damit in etwa beantwortet, und dann gebe ich gern zurück an.
I hope the question has been answered. So let's get back to Tuto. When I just showed those 4 minutes of video that we did not see before, and in that time you can maybe look for questions that have not been answered yet. Is that okay for you? Yes, I tried to do that. Okay, great.
To achieve the development we want as youths, as children, we need to ensure that the prioritization of government business over us as youth come to an end.
But the best way to go about development is ensuring that we have the right leaders. I think that's why it should start from, because I think like Sebastian said, we have some existing laws, we have processes that already exist that guide the development of processes. And I feel like when we have the right leaders who respect the policies, who respect the processes, who do not interfere or change the right channel to use when dealing with these developmental projects or developmental issues, then I think that would be the best way. And
the fact that who determines policy is the one who determines the development outcomes that each area, each country actually sees at the end of the day. So the fact that we don't have many young people in public office right now is a very huge deterrent factor in ensuring that we have the development we want as young people.
About encouraging youth to run for public office, because I think this is where we have the challenge mostly. It's because in all aspects of development, we should take heed that the way things were done probably 15 years ago and the way things are being done now because of the influence of social media and technology is different. Hence, young people need to be taking a brand.
The development we want to see in our area is that we wish that my policies anofanira kunyatsouya akanyatsokwana ekuti anongoonekwa achitema miti zviri uncontrolled anofanirwa kutopiwa mutongo unorwadza kuitira kuti miti yacho nekuda kwemitongo inorwadza zvotogona kutoita kuti vatye futi kutema zviri uncontrolled kutema nemazvo nharaunda yochengetedzeka.
So I'm urging us young people to ensure that we take up power, we also get into office, to ensure that we set development priorities according to the needs that we have as young people. So long we're out of power, so long we're not there in public office, that our development needs will never be prioritized.
Many of those elders, something like 10 years ago, now they are not alive. And who is living the consequences of their wrong decisions are the young people. First, they were not employed, and now they are running away from terrorism.
Thus, I urge youth to also take part in initiatives happening in the country. And
so we call upon young people and also stakeholders to support the participation of young people in politics and also ensuring that they're elected into office in various countries, ensure that the development we want is seen and felt in each and every aspect of our lives.
Ja, da sind noch zwei Beiträge, die man, glaube
I think there are two contributions that can be combined to one question, and the question is, what's the relation between interconnection with Ubuntu and the discussion of humans and non-human beings, nature as such. So what's the relation between those? So do all these living beings have rights? And how are they part of this discussion? Maybe just to start off, Ms. Matthew, please.
Yeah, I started answering that in the chat. So I'm not sure of the richness of this debate. I don't know it in full. There are some so Ubuntu mostly it's about humanness and human relations, and so it's very much focused on human, on relations between human beings rather than non-human beings. And from what I understand from some of the debate that I've seen, there are some who criticize it for that and say that, you know, especially in terms of maybe using it for alternatives to development, there is the lack of an environmental aspect to it, or a lack of concern for non-human beings. But I know that others see that as a limited understanding of Ubuntu, and that Ubuntu also has links to not only humanity, but even to the spiritual realm and to things beyond just concrete human relations. And then one can open it up and see that Ubuntu could be used in that way. So yeah, I guess I keep on saying the same thing, which is that a concept as broad and open as this is open to different kinds of interpretations. So it's usually spoken about in relation to human relations, but I don't think it's impossible to use it to think through also how we should relate to non-human entities and the environment.
Yes, from my understanding of Ubuntu, in the context of my country, it relates to human beings. So when we're talking about Ubuntu, I am saying I am appreciating the next person because their existence contributes to my existence. And my existence also contributes and plays a part to the existence of another person. So it's sort of a web, if I must say, Ubuntu in that context when we're just referring to human beings. To say we are saying there is no man who can stand as an island, but each and every one needs another person. So you are because I am because you are. So the concept of it probably being related to non-human beings, for me, it's not something that I might have a clear appreciation of. But in the context of just being Ubuntu, a sense of you are because I am because you are, in the human context, yeah, I think it stays like that, and I understand it better that way.
Okay, danke erstmal.
Thank you for the time being. I just have one personal question, and I read and I hear that Ubuntu is important for Ubuntu to show humanity state being together, belonging together, and a person only exists in the relationship to another person. So the question is, what's the difference? Isn't that a typical Western Christian concept? You can say that in Western world, individualization is exaggerated, but those basic ideas are from the colonial library, those terms.
Is that to me?
Yes, it is for you.
I think I'm not sure if I got that question entirely, but there was some concern around Christian values and Ubuntu and values that come from the colonial library and so on. What is interesting is with any concept, regardless of its origins and history, is that concepts come into interaction with other concepts. And so our expression of those concepts is never purely influenced by one source. So for example, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was the South African Archbishop, Anglican Archbishop for a long time, and also played a very important role in South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He used Ubuntu a lot, but his Ubuntu understanding is inflected strongly with Christian values, for sure, because he's an archbishop. And so then there's the critique that he's, putting in Christian ideas into this concept. I see that critique, but I think that inevitably there's no concept that is kind of buried intact and that can be expressed without interaction with any concept. So Ubuntu is articulated sometimes it is affected sometimes by maybe human rights discourse or Christian discourse or any other, or Africanist, Afrocentric discourse. All of those can affect and inflect the way in which people talk about Ubuntu. So I don't think, I don't know that we can police how people talk about it and say that Ubuntu must mean this, it must be anti-capitalist, or it must be environmentalist, or it must have this, you know, in some sense, it is open to interpretation, and any concept, the same goes for development, and I'm sure for Buen Vivir and other alternative concepts, they are articulated in relation to other discourses, and they are affected by those other discourses. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, Van. I didn't hear I don't understand German, so I heard a translation of it, but those are my thoughts.
Ja, das war schon in die richtige Richtung.
Yes, that was quite what I expected to hear. Tino Tender, would you like to comment on that question too?
I think I'm in agreement with learning what Michelle is saying there. So I don't think I'm going to comment on that question particularly.
Okay, dann ist da noch in einem Beitrag
So then there was one aspect in the chat that deals with a tradition. The question was, is Ubuntu, what's the relation of Ubuntu and long gone tradition, authentic African traditions, as far as they can still be traced? So maybe that would be a question for Ms. Matthews too, first.
Okay, so I think firstly, traditions in South Africa are not long gone, or in Africa generally. I mean, traditions reinvent themselves and take shape in different ways. So there's not really something like a tradition that then stopped and doesn't exist. But at the same time, the traditions that we see in South Africa or other places have changed over time. They don't look identical to how they might have looked 500 years ago. So, so this is one of the difficulties when trying to articulate Ubuntu. Sometimes there is an appeal to the past to say, you know, in the past in Africa, we did things like this and we need to revive this. And then Ubuntu language can be used as part of that revival. But there are some pertinent questions there as to whether or not we can revive practices that might have been in place in small rural communities in, say, an urban setting. So I think that Ubuntu discourse does take its inspiration from, or at least some Ubuntu discourse does take its inspiration from the practices of the past and does fit more broadly into discussions in Africa about reviving traditions and pushing back against Westernization. But at the same time, we have to recognize that in Africa and everywhere, traditions are always changing and always affected by whatever they come into contact with. So there isn't like some sort of pure tradition, set of traditions that we can find to draw on, but we can certainly draw inspiration from some of the practices of the past. And I think that some of those who do use Ubuntu discourse do that.
Okay, ja, vielen Dank. Und,
okay, then thank you very much, Tino Tender. would you like to comment? Because otherwise we are through with our questions, and I would have a last question for Ms. Matthews.
So, Ms. Matthews said in one of your essays that, well, there's one side that where there's a wish for an alternative that Ubuntu is supposed to represent, and on the other side, there's a great part, a major part of the African population who are still interested in Western, interested in profiting from Western ideas of development. Does that mean that Ubuntu is a bit of a playground?
Okay, if I understand you correctly, so I think that what I have said before is that, and I think this was reinforced with the discussion earlier and Tino Tendo's contribution as well about that question about inclusion in development or alternatives to development. Many people want are pushing, many people in Africa want inclusion in what maybe we can call Western style development, but I mean, it's not strange for anybody to wish to have effective sanitation, effective transportation, but sometimes that might be expressed in a desire for cars and roads and things that are also seen as prestigious because they're associated with the West. And so sometimes there are complicated ways in which people who are marginalized and oppressed will want to participate in having access to the things that they have been denied. This is important to take into consideration for those who want to push for radical, ecologically friendly alternatives, because sometimes when you articulate that in these spaces, people will say, well, why should we have a composting toilet and walk and take a bicycle and do all of these alternatives? We are humans just like everyone else. We want what you have. Why should we be deprived? So but I think, you know, it's very difficult to make a generalization. There are certainly people who oppose Westernization in Africa, and there are people who see, who associate Westernization with progress and development and who seek after it. I can't answer the question in full. I think the anthropologist James Ferguson, who writes a lot about development in Africa over time, he has dealt with this question in depth, if someone is interested. But what I think is important for this kind of discussion is to be attentive to what people are actually saying, so that it can be quite tempting to listen to the voices that say the things that we like. But certainly in South Africa, a lot of the most active protest activity is protest for inclusion in Western style housing, economic development, electricity, water and sanitation. And I think it is wrong to be deaf to those concerns or to say to such people, no, what you really want is some kind of environmental alternative. You are wrong. Because then once again, those who are in a more privileged position are preaching to the poor and the marginalized. You shouldn't want that. You shouldn't want a motorbike. You must want a bicycle. But it's really difficult, because at the same time, those of us who are aware of these big debates about the environment and about the failures of Western style development in the West might have some good arguments as well. So I find it very difficult, honestly. I struggle to navigate this difficult debate.
Ja, erstmal vielen Dank.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Matthews. I think these are exactly the questions that we will deal with in the future. So from my side, I'd like to express my thanks. And Ms. Heike Wagner also has found some questions in the chat. Well, we just decided to write down the questions from the chat, and I saw that Sally Matthews was very busy looking at the chat and already answered some of the questions. So my last question, we've got 2 minutes left, but we can take a little more time. I've got a last question to both of you. A question from Opara Asante. She's writing, how can alternative development for youth in Africa be implemented in a useful way, and add how I would also add the question that arose in a dynamic. Ms. Matthews, you warned us from romanticizing things, and I think that's a very important point. So I'd like to pick up this question from Parasante about what does the youth in Africa need, or how can concepts be implemented in a useful manner? Maybe that's a question for both of you. What do you believe we need right now? I say we in a general term. What's important in these debates? What would you say?
For me, I'm going to leave the questions on the youth to Tinotenda because I'm feeling very old. So yeah, I would like to hear too.
Haig, if you can just rephrase the question again.
Pardon? The question again?
Yeah.
Okay. The question, then I switched to English and the question is, how can alternative development be practical to the youth in Africa? But I kind of widened it to the question, what do you need, what do we need in a broader sense regarding development issues or questions for this future life? What do you think? What do we need right now? And this was kind of the closing question also to Sally. Thanks. Tinotenda writes that there is no sound right now here. So, or translation. There, the question, you can see the question in the chat. Don't you?
Okay, so the question is the one in the comment section, is it? The one says, how can alternative development be practical to the youth? All right. Alternative development can only be practical when we open up spaces where youth can be able to influence decision-making in development in things that actually hold relevance. Per se, when we are saying in terms of how we make plans for the communities, in terms of how we make plans for certain places, what's the view of the young people there? If we have just effective inclusion, where we can then have a results-based management system at the end to say, youth were saying we need this and this when we are about to set the agenda for development. So this is what is happening. Are the concerns of the youth also included in the results which are being yielded after the development is done or during the development process? I think it can become practical, but the practicality only comes when youth are involved. And when they are involved in a manner where their participation is not tokenism, not decorative, but it's participation which is practical, which is results-based, which is effective. Yeah, that was the question from, I think, Linda. I'm not sure if there was another question.
All right, so if I see it correctly, Tino Tender is muted, currently muted. And if we take a look at the watch, I see that we're a little over time, but we still got half an hour left before we come back. So I'd like to thank everyone. I'd like to thank Tino Tender and Mrs. Matthews for their patience and, well, their question answers that went easy, and I think these are questions that we will deal with in the future. We will now have a break and see you soon.